All right, good evening. This is our session on the Jeffersonian era, Jeffersonian period, which is 1800 to 1824. What we're looking at are the presidencies of Jefferson and Madison. And I'm going to kind of start off looking at a PowerPoint that I put together. It is on my Google site, and I'm going to share it with you now. And here we go. So one thing we want to do in A-Push is we want to build the content we learn in class. We want to build it around some very important big picture questions. And so the first big question I want you to think about as we go through this is, to what extent was Thomas Jefferson a man of contradiction? You know, where his actions match his ideology, his actions match his words. And so as we go through this, think about what kind of man, what Thomas Jefferson was in terms of his political thought, and did his actions as president match his ideology? Okay. What I want to, let's see. So looking at Jefferson, of course, Jefferson is an iconic figure in American history. He's elected in 1800, takes office in 1801. It is significant, and we'll get into his election later. But really honing in on Jefferson, really what he brought to American government is this concept of Jeffersonian democracy. Okay, Jeffersonian democracy, this idea of non-aristocratic democracy. Government for the people. He believed that government should be led, should be run by talented, literate elites, but that they should govern on behalf of all Americans. And of course, that big shift when we think of Jeffersonian democracy is this idea that the primary role of government is not necessarily the stability, to promote the stability and law and order of society, but to first and foremost to protect liberty, So Thomas Jefferson, of course, in any given age, in any given time, he was an absolute extraordinary individual, a man of many interests. This is a guy who dabbled in the sciences, who is a musician, spoke a number of languages, was an accomplished political theorist, a writer, a planter, a man who was deeply involved in architecture, and has a number of inventions to his name. So when you look at just the range of his interests, his abilities, and his accomplishments, in any age, you would say that Thomas Jefferson was an extraordinary individual. So what did we get with Jefferson? Number one, of course, unlike his predecessors, Jefferson sought to avoid the pomp and circumstance, which had characterized the Federalist administrations of John Adams and George Washington. And he sought to remove the formalities of the office, to the point to where when people would refer to him as Mr. Jefferson or Mr. President, he would correct them and admonish them, and would ask people to call him Mr. Jefferson. And so he felt like that the Federalists had really created a presidency that is close to being a kingship. And so he, as president, sought to minimize this. Of course, one of his greatest, in fact, his greatest political weapon was his ability to write. And he wrote dozens and dozens of letters daily, instructing party leaders, instructing people within the executive branch, writing to members of Congress. The power of the pen, that he had a tremendous gift for writing. And so he was not so much the speaker, and chose to communicate through writing. He discarded the presidential coach. And so when you saw Jefferson out and about in Washington, which of course, you know, what Jefferson is the first president to live in the new national capital in Washington, D.C. When you saw Jefferson out and about, you saw him on board his own horse. And so he discarded the presidential coach and chose otherwise to ride solitarily on board horseback. He abandoned the formal parties and levees barrels were once known for throwing. He discarded the rectangular tables in the White House and replaced them with circular tables. And so he felt like when the president sat at the table, he is an equal, and he's not the head of any table. So I thought that's very interesting. He ignored the rules of protocol. Being president, he felt like, for example, it says here, when brought together in society, all are perfectly equal. And the only custom he upheld in terms of protocol was ladies first. I think if you were to meet Jefferson, you would find out right away that he was very gentlemanly and chivalrous, especially when it came to the ladies. The dress, he did not dress the part as president. Unlike his predecessors, he would oftentimes don a robe and sandals in the White House. And when foreign dignitaries would come to visit, they would often be insulted by the way that the President of the United States would dress. They figured it wasn't, I guess, presidential enough. This is a man who had exquisite taste. He was a French chef, or he was not a French chef. He loved French food, and he preferred French cuisine. He actually is going to bring a slave of his to Paris to learn how to cook. And of course, after a number of years in Paris, he will bring his slave home. And so he is a man of very fine taste. He loved French cuisine, French wine. Of course, he is widowed. His wife passed away at a very early age, at a very young age. He they bore 6 children. She bore him 6 children, and only 2 would live past the age of 4. And so this is obviously a big deal, the fact that he does not remarry, even though he will maintain a number of relationships in his life. He was a slave owner, and of course, the story of Sally Hemings and his relationship with one of his slaves. It's not really allegedly anymore. The fact is that DNA has proven that Jefferson did have children with Mrs. Hemings. So we'll get to the Sally Hemings story later. He was an inventor. Of course, he's going to build his home in Monticello. Monticello was to Jefferson what Mount Vernon was to Washington. It was a place of peace and comfort to him. And oftentimes, that's where you found Mr. Jefferson. He spent as much time as he could at Monticello. He's the father of the University of Virginia, something he was very proud of. He puts this on his grace tombstone. University of Virginia was the first university in the United States that offered a classical education, not affiliated to any one church. So he's very proud of that. He's also proud of the fact that he was the author of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, which established the tradition of separation of church and state. Also, you find this on his tombstone at Monticello. These 2 right here were considered to be his crowning achievements. As an author of the Declaration of Independence, as we all know, Jefferson was a fervent defender and supporter of the Revolution, even afterwards. I think that's one way we describe Jeffersonian democracy. Jeffersonian democracy is really reverence of revolutionary ideals. So, but he was a man of the Enlightenment, and of course we could go back to our earlier lectures to get into the Enlightenment and the promotion of natural rights, natural laws, and he was definitely a devotee of the Enlightenment, and we see that in the Independence. He was other positions of power he held. Governor of Virginia, Minister to France. Of course, we know his activities. French Revolution, and his assistance in that endeavor. He was vice president to John Adams. Secretary of State under George Washington. He spoke 8 languages. And of course, by the end of his death, he will have amassed one of the largest personal collections of books in the country. And that collection became the foundation of the Library of Congress. So here, for him, this is what Zen was for him. He loved Mount Vernon. He spent his whole life building Mount Vernon, adding on to Mount Vernon, perfecting Mount Vernon. He integrated different types of architectural styles into Monticello. Did I say Mount Vernon? Monticello. You'll notice that it's got both Greek and Roman influences. He did spend a lot of time while in Europe drawing buildings and taking notes about the various types of architecture he saw while in Europe. And he would bring this home to him, to his beloved home in Virginia. So Jefferson's public life was not without turmoil, failure, and scandal, nor was his private life without tragedy and trouble. So we already talked about the death of his wife, which was a major turning point for him. And of course, throughout all of his adult life, he was in severe debt. He was in major debt. So a couple things, couple areas I want to address before we move on to the history of his presidency is his religion. I think getting into the character of Thomas Jefferson, the fact is many of our founding fathers were deists. Deists were essentially of the belief that God exists, but not as not as someone who is intervening in the daily lives of people. Deism is basically rooted in more of a rational, scientific view of the supernatural. Okay, so but very much what we find is that throughout much of his early life, Jefferson got a really bad taste in his mouth with the Anglican Church. Between 1759 and 1762, he began to reject the English Church, and many historians really believe that a lot of this was a product of just being a rebel. Youth rebellion is part of growing up. Of course, this is also an area of time in his life in which he was in college. He did go to college very young. Was one of the youngest Virginians ever to pass the bar exam, to become a lawyer and a practicing attorney. So he was kind of a child prodigy, and so very young he really began to reject the English ways of thinking, and that included Anglicanism. His professor, one of his teachers, Professor Small. This is what Jefferson will refer to later on in his life as a very influential person for him. He told little Jefferson to let reason dictate what you believe. And so reason is, of course, what we refer to as the ability to it's more of a rational way of seeing the world. It's a way to try to divorce emotion and feeling out of in our senses when it comes to the truth. And so reason, this is going to be hammered into him at a very young age. He came to believe that the great moral writers were those from antiquity and not from the Bible. So this is Jefferson growing up. Okay. Now, Jefferson's earliest writings on religion exhibit a natural theology, a heavy reliance on reason, and a belief that morality comes not from special revelation from any religious texts, but from careful attention to the inward moral sense. In a letter to his nephew, Peter Carr, in 1787, Jefferson advised, quote, "Fix reason firmly in her seat and call to her tribunal every fact. Question with boldness even the existence of a God." And so this is what we really find, is he believes in this concept of a natural theology, that really where we find the meaning of life is in nature. Okay, the meaning of life, we find it in nature. And this is kind of the way of the world. This is the Enlightenment. Okay, this is the enlightened thinking, is that in nature there are natural laws all throughout nature. Okay, that what God did give us is he gave us natural laws. Natural laws. And that it was our responsibility as humans to discover those natural laws that govern government, science, okay, religion, all that stuff, okay? So, all right. So the character of Jefferson's religion is one of the most interesting aspects of his life. Evangelicals often criticized Jefferson's deist-related beliefs. They constantly attacked him because of his beliefs, his religious beliefs. Ironically, it says here, in spite of the attacks, evangelicals flocked to support him politically because they favored an end of tax support for established churches like the Anglican Church, which meant freedom for their independent churches as passionately as he did. Today, religious conservatives portray Jefferson as a sympathetic figure, unaware of his religious beliefs and understanding of religious freedom, or his criticisms of evangelical religiosity. Okay, so even though he was a deist, he did remain a seeker. He had not given up hope to figure the whole religion thing out. He believed that God did exist, but he only existed to keep natural laws working. And so he didn't believe in revealed religion through the Bible, yes, and which of course included, he didn't believe in the idea of miracles or divine intervention, or I think pretty importantly, the divinity of Christ himself. In 1792, while in Paris, he meets with really a renowned scientist, Joseph Priestley. Joseph Priestley is a scientist who will have discovered the principles of oxygen. Priestley was a fellow deist who convinced Thomas Jefferson that Jesus was the greatest moral teacher of all time, and he pushed Jefferson to reconsider the New Testament, and to basically chip away at the man-made stuff in the Bible, and just study Jesus as a man of history, and get to the essence as to who he was. And so that's exactly what Jefferson did. And so Jefferson then would spend, by 1800, Jefferson is convinced that no longer are the Greeks and the Romans the greatest moral teachers of all time. They no longer come from antiquity. He's convinced that Jesus is the greatest moral teacher in history. And to prove it, he cut and pasted, as you can see in this picture here. He would take passages of the Bible out of the New Testament, passages that largely were the words of Jesus himself, And he created what was called the Jefferson Bible, where and then he would then take the Jefferson Bible and um, um, create different versions of it: English, French, Latin, and Greek. And so that's Jefferson, and that's pretty cool, honestly. He hated, of course, when his enemies attacked him for being an atheist. He took that very personal, and it made him very angry, because he wasn't an atheist. He was a seeker. He was trying to figure it out. And at the end of the day, he felt like religion is a personal thing. Religion and faith is between God and each individual person, and government needs to get out of the way out of that. And so there was no one who was more supportive and more defensive of religious liberty than Thomas Jefferson, because he believed that religion was very personal, and it was between God and the individual, and not God, the government, and the individual. And so when he's trying to divorce the government out of religion, he's doing it to protect religious liberty for all people. Hold on a second. Okay. So everyone believes in something. Jefferson believed in nature, which he saw as the visible creation of God. He believed that God gave us nature, and within nature there are laws that govern nature, and it's the responsibility of man to discover those laws, to define those laws in the realm of science, whether it be biology or chemistry or physics or astronomy. He believed that the natural law, nature, the laws that govern nature, were created by an all-powerful God. However, God gave man the ability of reason in order to go out and discover those laws. In 1785, in the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, considered by himself as his greatest life work, he lays out the importance of religious freedom. Remember what it's all about? It's about getting religion, government out of the business of coercing people to believe a certain theology. Of course, a lot of it is he's railing against the Anglican Church. From a very young, early age, he hated their rules. Of course, the church required people to believe in the Trinity. The church also required people to believe in their 39 tenets. And he didn't believe that individuals ought to be coerced to believe anything that by any government, whether it was religious in nature or whether it was political in nature. And of course, he founded the University of Virginia, which promoted freedom of ignorance. He divorced the church. He divorced the University of Virginia from Anglicanism and adopted more of classical learning. And so what's really interesting is he really kind of saw himself as an authentic Christian, that he was a church of one, and that he was Christian. He was just his kind of Christian. And which is really, I've always teach this when it comes to Thomas Jefferson, because it's just it's a side of the man that I think hardly ever gets analyzed. Another area we need to look at is Jefferson and the slavery issue. Something, of course, which today is we're very, very sensitive about today. Whoa. Let's see. Let me try to do this here. Discard those. Okay. So let me go here. All right, we're doing good. All right. I'm back. Good to see you. This is what I want to do. Let's look here. And let's go there. But the issue of slavery, of course, is very important in APUSH. I think in any American history class, the story of slavery is going to be one that needs to be analyzed and scrutinized a great deal.
He mentioned Thomas Jefferson. He wrote a biography of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had slaves.
Yeah, I read it. Had slaves and children with the slaves.
Exactly.
And it does matter.
Should they take down the
I think
Memorial?
that people need to understand when people that were enslaved and robbed of even the right to marry and had forced sex with their slave masters. This is personal to us. My great-grandfather was a slave in South Carolina owned by the family that ended up, Strom Thurmond was one of them, a newspaper discovered it. So this is personal. This is not some kind of removed discussion from us. Our families were victims of this. Certainly it ought to be removed.
Therefore, everybody associated with slavery in terms of any public monument to them.
When you look at the fact that public monuments are supported by public funds, you're asking me to subsidize the insult of my family.
Thomas Jefferson had slaves.
And I would repeat that the public should not be paying to uphold somebody who has had that kind of background. You have private museums, you have other things that you may want to do that.
All right, so you can see that the issue of slavery is, and as it relates to Thomas Jefferson, is a very, very important issue today. And so let me show you, okay, so that's one side. That's Al Sharpton, the Reverend Al Sharpton, and his viewpoint. Let me find, where is it? Okay, this is from another viewpoint. This is the other side. We won't listen to the whole thing.
To understand what's happening now, it's always useful to venture back in time a little bit, which we will do now via the magic of audio soundbites. Greetings, my friends, and welcome. I was so excited to get started, I didn't officially introduce the program. It is the Rush Limbaugh program here, the EIB network. Now, 27 million as the audience continues to expand by leaps and bounds. Telephone number 800-282-2882. Audio soundbite 4, and in order, this is Charlie Rose and Al Sharpton last night on Charlie Rose's PBS show, and this is their discussion about getting rid of the Jefferson Memorial.
Thomas Jefferson had slaves.
Had slaves and children with the slaves.
Exactly. Should they take down the
I
Jefferson
think
Memorial?
that people need to understand when people that were enslaved and robbed of even the right to marry and had forced sex with their slave masters. This is personal. This is not some kind of removed discussion from us. Our families were victims of this. Public monuments are supported by public funds. You're asking me to subsidize the insult of my
Thomas
family.
Jefferson had slaves.
And I would repeat that the public should not be paying to uphold somebody who has had that kind of background.
Way to go. Charlie, who are you trying to impress here? Why do you even need it on this show? You don't even need to be there. You know, just turn the segment over to Al Sharpton, tell him he's got a minute. What's going on here? This kind of tripe, unchallenged, and I even make Sharpton explain this loop that this isn't going to go away. These are people that cannot be mollified. These people are going to have to be defeated, folks.
All right. So as you can see on both sides of the political spectrum, you know, this is Jefferson today is very much relevant. He's still very relevant today in our political discourse. And so we just have to, as a nation, you know, get the truth of Thomas Jefferson and his issue of being a slave owner. And then we'll let you decide whether you're going to side with Al Sharpton or with Rush Limbaugh. or maybe find a little middle ground. Middle ground is always good to find. So let's look at slavery. First of all, slavery was pretty much accepted until 1750, when people really began to question the morality of slavery. Of course, we then fought a revolution. Revolution was based on the idea of all men are created equal. You know, Jefferson is going to, right, if you see here in the very first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he lays the blame of slavery in America at the feet of the English king, and of course the slave trade as well. Of course, after the Revolution, the northern states are going to, one by one, the northern states are going to abolish slavery, and of course, the Northwest Ordinance will forbid slavery north of the Ohio River. So really, get to the 70s, really begin to attack slavery as a moral issue. Jefferson is one of these guys who's morally conflicted. He has doubts. He believes that all people have the inherent right to be free. And you see that in his Declaration of Independence. He will, when he is as a lawmaker in Virginia, he proposes a law ending the importation of new slaves. You guys have to really understand this, okay? That the most horrific aspect of slavery was the slave trade. The slave trade, the Middle Passage, the importing of slaves from Africa and from the Caribbean. That was the grossest, that was the most despicable aspect of the entire institution. And Jefferson believed that if we cannot abolish slavery, we have to abolish the slave trade, because the slave trade is absolutely horrific. And so you see from a very early point in his life, in his career, he is very interested in ending the importation of new slaves. In 1781, he proposes a law that all slaves be freed by 1800 in Virginia. Now, obviously, we all know that fails. AOC, the AOC government fails by one vote to abolish slavery in all territories west of the Appalachian Mountains, and that was a law that, had it passed, may have prevented a civil war down the road. But that was a law that Jefferson ultimately supported and encouraged people to vote against. So then at the end, so you ask, well, why did Jefferson accept slavery? And really, it was a personal issue. He was in debt most of his life. This guy had a problem with spending money. He spent money on a lot of products from France. He bought tons of dollars worth of books and cuisine and wine. And I mean, just the guy was buy things, and he had very exquisite tastes. Also, state law in Virginia at the time stipulated that once one frees the slaves, he would then be required to leave the state indefinitely. And he'd worked too hard on Monticello to surrender it. Now, ultimately, he does, at the end of his life, many of his slaves will be sold to pay his debts, the debts that he had at the end of his life. But before he did that, he did free a number of his slaves prior to his death, including the family of Sally Hemings, which was a slave that he had a long relationship with, and of course fathered children with. So and of course he believes that, like many American leaders, that by taking on slavery, that could lead to disunity in the country. And he believed that the will of the voters will ultimately, at the end of the day, the voters will decide when slavery will be abolished. Okay, when slavery will be abolished. In 1783, Jefferson is, like I said before, this is what I was mentioning about the AOC government. Jefferson is on a committee that drafts a proposal to ban slavery in the territories west of the Appalachians. It fails by a vote. Wow. Considering that the Civil War was fought primarily over the expansion of slavery, the 1783 proposal could have prevented war. Now, some fodder on the other side that's aimed at Jefferson is, to what extent was Jefferson a racist? Now, a lot of critics of Jefferson point to his notes on the state of Virginia. In there, Jefferson states that, yeah, even though slavery is wrong, slavery corrupted government. It spoiled government. He believes that, however, if you push too fast on ending slavery, it'll do nothing but cause unrest. He believed that Negroes were inferior to whites. And much of this came from the readings of European science. He was a massive, he was like had an insatiable appetite for reading and reading the research and all the different scientific experiments, discoveries going on in Europe at the time. And so kind of what's going on in the world, in the intellectual world in Europe is scientists are trying to find racial differences between the different races, and a number of leading European scientists made the argument that there was distinctive differences between blacks and whites. And so, but he also said in the notes of the state of Virginia, he said that a new generation of Americans reared in freedom will ultimately decide the issue, which, of course, he's wrong. That didn't happen. The abolition of slavery must be preceded by the abolition of the slave trade. So what had to happen first was getting away with the slave trade. And then he believed that once you abolish the slave trade, we'll have a domino effect, and that slavery as an institution would be next to die. And of course, he was wrong there too. So, but attitudes in the country will radically change on slavery. Remember, as I mentioned, slavery was by the 1750s, people really began to attack the morality of slavery. But by the 1790s, it really began to change around the turn of the century. One is, of course, the cotton gin. The cotton gin will help revive an institution that was ironically dying. It was dying as an institution, but the cotton gin enabled the Southern economy to transition out of just simply growing tobacco and other products to growing cotton. And the cotton gin led to the growth of these plantations. Plantations began to increase, and with that, as the plantations got larger and the cotton crop got larger, then the number of slaves were also will increase right along with it. And the Haitian Revolution happens at the turn of the century. There's a big fear in the South that what happened in Haiti might happen in America. So rather than work to destroy slavery and to replace slavery with something else, slave owners, as a result of the Haitian Revolution, instead enacted harsh slave codes and which basically ended any chance of abolishing slavery. But late in life, Jefferson, on the eve of his death, Jefferson is depressed, and big reason he's depressed is he knows that he was unable to, in his life, see the slavery go away. And so he's very upset. And he's also depressed because the new generation of leaders, they lack the will and they lack the backbone to free slaves. And they find that the second generation of American leaders are more racist than the founding generation. So that also fueled his depression. So Thomas Jefferson, he's identified around the world for democracy and human rights. So if you use the word Thomas Jefferson around the world, he is well respected and known for his ideas and his ideology supporting democracy, human rights for all people. He is elected in 1800. As you can see, it was a very close election. It's a revolution because it was the first ever peaceful transfer of power from one party, the Federalist Party, to a new party, the Republican Party. And it happened, as this lady said here, a Washington lady wrote in her diary, quote, "The changes of administration, which in every age have most generally been epics of confusion, villainy, and bloodshed, in this our happy country take place without any action, or in a lot of places in the world, even today, that anytime power is transferred from one person to another or from one party to another, there's usually always violence. But that's what made the Revolution of 1800 special, is that you didn't have the violence. You know, the fact is that Mr. Jefferson right here, or Mr. Adams, the morning of the inauguration, he left in the very wee hours. He left to go home to Massachusetts. He did not stay behind to protest the election or to resist leaving office. He accepted the defeat, and then he went home and he lived the rest of the remainder of his life in his home there in Braintree in Quincy, Massachusetts. So 1800, it ended in a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And according to the Constitution, anytime there's a tie, the House of Representatives breaks the tie. And they actually casted a number of ballots, and dozens of in the Electoral College, or excuse me, in the House. And eventually the tie was broken by no more than Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton pulled the strings behind the scenes to see to it that Thomas Jefferson, his old arch rival nemesis, in large part because he felt that Burr lacked the character to occupy the office that once was held by Hamilton's boss, George Washington. So very significant election in American history. It did reveal a weakness in the Constitution, and it's a weakness that they will fix in terms of preventing ties and really seeing to it that the vice president is not the runner-up. I think that's going to come to an end. You see in this election alliance of Virginia and New York, which created a rift between Hamilton and Burr. And of course, this all sets up the whole duel. And we get this from Founding Brothers, a book that we read in my class. Hamilton is going to publish a pamphlet during this election questioning the fitness of Adams to win a second term. And it will be circulated among Federalist leaders. And so Hamilton is really working behind the scenes to see to it that Adams doesn't win and that ultimately Burr is to be denied. Jefferson will become vilified as well. His opponents will label him a Jacobin. Jacobin, of course, those are the most bloody advocates of the bloody French Revolution. They call him an atheist. They say that his election would bring dwellings in flames, hoary hairs bathed in blood, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike. And so it really nasty. I think one thing that is definitely true of the election of 1800, of how nasty it truly was. Let me go back and show you this. Okay, here we go. Let's go to all right, here we are again. There's me. Let's go right here. All right, let's go to election of 18. Right there. That's awesome. Watch this, you'll like it.
If you write anything
Not
on your
this.
computer, you need to get Grammarly.
I write pretty much all day.
Some political watchers are saying this could be the nastiest, most negative election season of all time.
This campaign season seems like candidates have taken dirty to a whole new level.
When pundits start shouting and politicians start calling each other's names, it can seem like a return to civility is not possible. Like the very idea is a relic of some bygone era.
John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who wants to start a war with France. While he's not busy importing mistresses from Europe, he's trying to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George. Haven't we had enough monarchy in America?
I'm Thomas Jefferson, and I approve this message because John Adams is a hideous, hermaphroditical character with neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
Wins. Murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed. The soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike?
I'm John Adams, and I approve this message because Jefferson is the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hoe cakes, and Hamilton is a Creole bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
The nastiest, most negative election.
Candidates have taken dirty to a whole new
It can
level.
seem like a return to civility is not possible.
Okay, I thought you guys might enjoy that. So yeah, I mean, we think politics today was dirty. Oh my goodness, politics back then was, the election of 1800 was really, really nasty. It's important to understand that too.
In 1800, Adams and Jefferson face off once again.
Okay, so let's move on and let's continue with PowerPoint here. Okay. Let's see. There we go. We're doing good. Okay, so his cabinet, of course, his Secretary of State is James Madison. What you need to know, make sure you jot this down, that in the early republic, the position of Secretary of State was considered to be the stepping stone to the president, to the presidency. Okay, so before he was president of the United States, Jefferson was Secretary of State. Before he was president, James Madison was Secretary of State. Before he was president, James Monroe was Secretary of State. Before he was president, John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State. So you kind of get the point. Secretary of State is a very important position, and right in line with what we know from founding brothers. There's no person that Jefferson would have put as Secretary of State than James Madison. James Madison, of course, is his trusted advisor, his sidekick. Those two guys were a very important tandem. Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin. Gallatin, of course, will be very instrumental in trying to manipulate Hamilton's economic programs. And of course, other positions were filled by New England Federalists. So like his predecessors, he tried to balance his cabinet. In other offices, Jefferson avoided wholesale reappointments and chose to leave many Federalists in their jobs. So this is kind of odd. Jefferson, what we know about Jefferson is that he's a very partisan guy, but yet as president, he isn't. So that's a big contradiction. Of course, he, like I said before, here's the White House, and he is the first occupant of the White House. March 4th, 1801, Jefferson, tall, thin, and ill-fitting clothes, red hair, and a ruddy complexion, became the first president to be inaugurated in the new federal city of Washington, D.C. With the Congress having met in 8 different towns and cities since 1774, at last we have a permanent home. Jefferson's informal inauguration befitted the primitive surroundings. The president walked 2 blocks to the unfinished Senate to take the oath of office from Chief Justice John Marshall. Then he read his inaugural address in a barely audible voice. A tone of simplicity and reconciliation ran through his speech. He said, First one, this of course is a note card term. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who wish to dissolve the Union or to change its Republican form, then let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. So he's really trying to reach across to the Federalists. I think what you find in this quote is that he's trying to bring in moderate Federalists who, because he's trying to bring in people from the Federalists, moderate Federalists, to try to grow his party. Some disaffected Federalists who may be looking to join up with maybe a Republican coalition. So basically, you're non-Hamilton Federalists. Just trying to bring those people into their fold. And plus, remember, as you saw in that ad, the election was really, really nasty. And so he was trying to bring some calm and peace and tranquility to American politics. He also, but definitely his inaugural address was very Republican. He talks about here equal and exact justice to all men. And so if you look at this right here, okay, if you look at this right here, think about right now what this is referring to. Equal and exact justice to all men. Think about it. The Alien and Sedition Act. The Alien and Sedition Act. He's basically saying we've got people that are sitting in jail right now for having violated the Alien and Sedition Act, and we need justice for those people. We need justice for those people. He goes on to talk about peace, commerce, honest friendship with all nations. Okay, so what is this referring to? Keeping us out of a war with England and France. Adams has already made peace with France. Our big problem right now is with England. Okay, so really what he's trying to do, he's trying to vow to maintain Washington's policies of no entangling alliances and staying clear, remaining neutral from any belligerency with Europe or any European country. Goes on to talk about freedom of religion and freedom of the press. Of course, freedom of press, that's the Alien Sedition Acts. Freedom of person under protection of habeas corpus, trial by juries, impartially selected. It says, may the wisdom of our sages and the blood of our heroes have been devoted to their attainment. So the blood of our heroes, he's talking about the revolution. It says we've got to get back to the ideas of the revolution. We got to honor the revolution. We've strayed from those ideals, and so this speech is very conciliatory, but at the same time, he is really interjecting a lot of very important Republican ideas. He goes on to say here on Republican government, says, I know indeed that some honest men fear that Republican government cannot be strong, that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot in the full tide of successful experiment abandon a government which has so far kept us free and firm, and on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may, by possibility, want energy to preserve itself? I trust not. I believe this, on the contrary, that the strongest government on earth, to be the strongest government on earth, I believe it is the only one where every man would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. So I want you to think about this. I want you to go through this quote, and I want you to think about what he's talking about here and what he's referring to as to Republican government. This idea that it's not great, it's not perfect, you know, but it's the best. It's the best hope for all people around the world, right? This government is not, you know, it's something that needs to be defended. It needs to be protected. It needs to be spread. Every man and woman needs to commit themselves to see to it that the government is successful, you know, because the only alternative we have is the form in which kings govern man. And to him, this is just absolutely horrific. So with Jefferson, with the new political party in power, a lot of a lot of Federalist policies, he left those in place. Hamilton's economic plan. Now Jefferson could have gone in and he could have undid. He could have gone in and undid all of it, but he left it. He maintained the Bank of the United States, and we know that Jefferson was a huge opponent of the bank. He retained the tariff, which originally Jefferson opposed because he thought the tariff did great harm to farmers and people who export crops to overseas markets. That the tariff really only benefited the northern economy at the expense of the South. But he keeps the tariff. He doesn't tamper with Federalist programs for funding the debt at par. Remember, debt at par is about repaying the bondholders from the American Revolution. You know, he believes that that's a promise that Hamilton and Washington made, and we've got to continue to pay our debts to those people. He could have undone the whole assumption of state debts, but he left that in place. So Jefferson's a guy who really talked one way before he was president, and then once he became president, he really didn't go in and wreck shop. Why? Because he wanted to heal the rift between the parties. Jefferson was more, to him, it was more important than accommodating the Federalists, working with the Federalists. And he knew that by going in and tampering with all of these Federalist programs, that American politics would become even muddier. It'd become even muddier. So he was more bipartisan as president of the United States than any other point in his career. He did reduce and remove. Now, there are some exceptions. Now, Jefferson did reduce and exhaust. He removed a lot of the excise taxes, many of them that had been placed on farmers. He did repeal and the Alien and Sedition Acts. He used his power of pardon, his pardoning power to remove newspaper editors and opponents of that bill out of prison, out of jail. So he did reverse a lot of Federalist programs, but he left a lot intact as well. So really what we find in Thomas Jefferson, as you see down here, is that as president, he was moderate. He was a very moderate candidate. He was less partisan and less radical, as he had been before. Okay. I want to address this too. I know we've talked a lot about this in class, but the Hamiltonians believed in building a large standing army, and Jefferson opposed it because he thought that standing armies that a standing army could lead to tyranny. You know, I mean, what did Napoleon Bonaparte do with the French military, with that standing army? You know, when you're in Europe, standing armies they're pretty important. I mean, you got to have one. But in America, is a standing army necessary? An army that Jeffersonians believed the army was a threat to liberty, to the liberties of human beings, to Americans. And so what he proposed and what he preferred were, in order to protect the homeland, Jefferson preferred a navy, becoming a naval power, and using militias, state militias, and not using a large standing army. And so that's one thing that he began to nullify as president of the United States. He did emphasize states' rights. He encouraged the development of agriculture, agrarianism. Okay. So let's just talk about some of the issues and some of the successes of President Jefferson. Okay, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Okay, 12th Amendment. 12th Amendment is important. The 12th Amendment sought to remedy the issue. Sorry, guys, for the dogs. Sought to remedy the issue of tie votes between presidential candidates from the same party. So what the 12th Amendment did in 1804 is electors had to specify that they were voting for one presidential candidate and one vice presidential candidate. They had to basically cast 2 votes for president. Okay? So next. I'm very sorry. Okay. Hold on a second. Okay. I'm sorry. So what defined the domestic issue, domestically in the Jefferson presidency, really had a lot to do with the midnight judges. And in the early morning hours before leaving office, John Adams, President Adams, expanded the judiciary, the judicial branch of government, by almost a third by creating new judgeships, new positions in the federal judiciary. And he essentially stacked the judiciary with Federalists. The big problem, the reality, what happened in 1800 is not only did the Federalists lose the White House, but the Federalists also lost control of both houses of Congress. And so Adams felt like in order to government and have checks and balances, he sought to manipulate the judicial branch so that the judicial wasn't also leaning towards the Republicans. Okay, and this, of course, if we learn in the French and the Friendship in Founding Brothers, when John Adams appointed the midnight judges, this did a great deal of harm to the long friendship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Would be Chief Justice John Marshall. John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme, and he was appointed, as I said, in 1801 as part of the Judiciary Act of 1801. And he's perhaps one of the most important Supreme Court judges in U.S. history, having served in that position for 34 years. He will maintain Federalist principles in his decisions even after the Federalist Party disbanded in 1816. And so even though the Federalists will never again hold power in the federal government, because of John Marshall, the judicial branch will project a very strong Federalist viewpoint for the next 30 plus years. The big landmark case, which John Marshall will use to enhance the power of the Supreme Court, it's called Marbury versus Madison, gives the federal courts, gives the Supreme Court its power of judicial review, which is the power to review congressional laws, and they have the power to rule laws unconstitutional. So back against the judiciary, and of course he really worked to block a lot of Jefferson's domestic programs. And so Jefferson sought out to try to impeach these judges, and it failed. One after Ingalls Chase. And of course, in the Constitution of the United States, you can remove a government official, you can impeach a government official for what are called high crimes and misdemeanors. I mean, that's the exact wording that's used in the Constitution, high crimes and misdemeanors. So what high crime, what misdemeanor did Samuel Chase, was he guilty of? And according to Samuel Chase, because he was too partisan. Well, that's not a high crime and misdemeanor. And so the impeachment of Samuel Chase failed. And when he failed to get Samuel Chase, pretty much became a foreign policy president. Elastic will be his court for the remainder of his presidency. Class, we're going to do of these John Marshall cases. Okay. Other issues going on. Jefferson will American commerce in the Mediterranean by using our brand new Navy that began construction under John Adams, something that Jefferson continued to pour money into. And the U.S. Navy will successfully fight naval combat with the Barbary pirates, which is the Barbary states on the northern coast of Africa. These pirates were preventing American merchant ships from trading in the Mediterranean. And so Jefferson essentially declared war against these pirates and successfully defended American rights in the Mediterranean. Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Louisiana Purchase is perhaps the greatest, one of the greatest achievements any president has ever achieved. It doubled the size of the United States virtually overnight. He learned that Napoleon was interested in selling the Louisiana Territory, and Napoleon was in need of cash because he was trying to finance a very costly war in Europe. Also, the Haitian Rebellion broke out in 1791. It was led by Toussaint Louverture, who led ex-slaves in a very bloody revolt. And so that the Haitian Revolution also will convince Napoleon of the importance of kind of cutting and running and unloading much of his North American empire to the Americans. And so Jefferson sent a delegation to Paris with instructions to buy the Louisiana Territory, which they did for $15 million, which really works out to 3 cents an acre. So for 3 cents an acre, Jefferson purchased the richest river valley in the world. The richest river valley in the world. The Mississippi River Valley currently produces enough food to feed 60% of the world's population. And by adding the Louisiana Purchase to the United States, Louisiana Territory to the United States, he saw and he envisioned farms, agriculture, which is all part of his goal of agrarianism. And so one point I want you to know about the Louisiana Purchase is that he, in order to purchase it, he had to become a loose constructionist. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the President of the United States can buy territory from a foreign country without congressional approval. And that's exactly what he did. The Federalists, who were known to be loose constructionists, Louisiana Purchase, and of course they argued it was so the patient. Yeah. What Jefferson wanted the most, or the most that flow into the Mississippi River. So wanted to purchase New Orleans. What they was all the land between the Mississippi Republican states, they wouldn't be Federalist states. Jefferson saw this territory as potential for each senator's electoral votes. So for every new state that is created, the Republicans would be increasing their power. And that's why the Federalists opposed. So it guaranteed, like I said, unfettered access to the Mississippi River. It gave us New Orleans. It paved the way for Western expansion. It accelerated the economic and political, the rise of the United States as an economic and political power. Okay? Now, sadly, is the destruction of Indian culture. However, it did end European expansion in North America. In threat on the U.S. frontier. It helped avoid a possible war angling alliance with Britain. Was now Jefferson as it began to grow into the West. The West became a lot more loyal as Jefferson's huge hero. Now, as we bought this, had no idea whether or not we bought a lemon or not. So Jefferson sent, okay, hold on a second. All right, let's see. Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark. Oh, okay. This is their, so he sent Meriwether Lewis and George Rogers Clark from St. Louis along the Missouri River to map, chart the territory. Actually, another expedition led by Zebulon Pike on a more southerly track, okay? Because he wanted them to go out, and really the number one goal of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was 1804 to 1806, all-water route to the Pacific. And they were hopeful that the Missouri River was indeed an all-water route to the Pacific. Now, even though they didn't find an all-water route to the Pacific, what they found was probably the best thing they found was Oregon. Oregon, they came away from Oregon thinking that this is a very nice area. Basically, what Lewis and Clark are going to do, they're going to create journals, and they're going to take notes, and they're going to have diaries. In which they will describe the layout of the land, the climate, basically the potential. They came back to Jefferson with oh boy, I'm sorry guys. Oh, Lewis and Clark came back and they were able to create a lot of excitement. Hold on a second. Sammy? Hold on, I'll be right back. I apologize, guys. It's the dogs. I need to do this at school. Okay, so Lewis and Clark came back with intel about how awesome the territory west of the Mississippi was, and it helped to generate even greater interest in people moving west. In fact, Oregon is going to be a location where many Americans to the east are going to seek to relocate because of Lewis and Clark's intelligence that they were able to gather about the territories here. Okay, so I mean, ultimately, within the next decade or so, right along the Missouri River here, you're also going to see what's called the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail is going to bring thousands of Americans into the Oregon country, in large part because of Lewis and Clark's expedition. Okay, and of course, the young lady that helped Lewis and Clark navigate through this terrain was an Indian woman by the name of Sacagawea. Okay. Now, last point here, we're getting near the end. What consumed much of, okay, hold on a second. Tell you what, let's look here. Now, what consumed much of Jefferson's foreign policy, some of the major foreign policy challenges that Jefferson had, was keeping the United States out of the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars broke out between Great Britain and France during the Jefferson presidency, and so Jefferson was committed to keeping the United States neutral, and Britain issued what was called the Order in Council in 1806, mandating that any American ship that did not stop in Britain during the continental Europe, that ship would be confiscated. And so during the Napoleonic Wars, the British and their Navy began to seize American ships, began to impress American sailors. And impressment basically means kidnap. They would kidnap American sailors, enlist them by force in the British Navy. Between 1808 and 1811, some 6,000 Americans were impressed in the British Navy, and many of those were killed during that service. And so you got to understand that when the United States won their independence, the British lost about 1/3 of its population. And so the British Navy had a very difficult time filling a navy, basically recruiting enough sailors to fill all their ships. And so that's what drove the impressments. That's what drove the impressments. Okay, but the French under Napoleon, they also he issued what was called the Berlin Decree, and the Berlin Decree they essentially was the same as the British Orders in Council, and that is American ships would be seized at any of the continental ports, and its cargoes would be confiscated. So really, what do we have here during President Jefferson's years is you had Jefferson trying to keep America out of a war between England and France. And it was a war in which both England and France were guilty of violating American shipping and seizing our ships. The British, of course, impressing our sailors as well. And Jefferson had to react to. We had what was called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. It took place on June 21st, 1807. The Chesapeake Leopard Affair. This is it. The British commander of the Leopard demanded the surrender of 4 British deserters that were on board the USS Chesapeake. The American captain refused to give up those 4 sailors, and so the Leopard fired on the Chesapeake, killed 3 American sailors, wounded 18, and Americans reacted to the Chesapeake Leopard Affair the same way that Americans acted 10 years earlier, the XYZ affair. Americans wanted war. So Jefferson, like Adams, rather than going to war, Jefferson enacted what was called the Embargo Act. Okay. Whoops. Whoa. Sorry about that. So the Embargo Act of 1807, it forbade all exports of all goods from the United States to any destination, not just England, not just France, anywhere. Jefferson believed that a U.S. embargo would force Great Britain and France to respect our rights, to respect our neutrality. Okay. This is also important because the embargo 1907 also represented a loose constructionist point of view. The Federalists believed that Jefferson was enacting an embargo to intentionally harm and to destroy the New England economy. And as it was, the Embargo Act was an absolute disaster for the U.S. economy. U.S. exports equaled 108 million, okay, in 1807. And a year later, in 1808, it had plummeted to 22 million. So that was almost an 80% drop in exports. The South and the West saw dramatic declines of their export of cotton and tobacco and grain. And really, at the end of the day, The embargo didn't work, and it did a lot more damage to us than it did to England or France. Now, ironically, and this is really ironic, considering that Jefferson wanted this nation to be a nation of farmers. He promoted agrarianism. The embargo of 1807 inadvertently sparked the Industrial Revolution here in America. New England was forced to become more self-sufficient. And so rather than rely on British textile mills, New England began to build their own textile factories. And so, which is really, really, really ironic, because Jefferson, his actions led to the building of factories and mills and industries. And that's something that he sought to avoid. So ultimately, when Jefferson left office in 1809, his successor, James Madison, inherited this mess with the British, and Madison will replace the Embargo Act with what's called the Non-Intercourse Act. And the Non-Intercourse Act was designed to lift the embargo on all countries except for Great Britain and France. So, but ultimately, when you look at Jefferson's legacy as president, it's kind of mixed. He did keep us out of war. He did it through embargo. He created non-aristocratic government, what we call Jeffersonian democracy. His Louisiana Purchase and the subsequent Lewis and Clark expeditions ultimately led to the expansion of the West. And we will start to see during this period a slow declining death of the Federalist Party in America. So the next session, the next video I'll produce for you will cover the Madison years, really focusing in on the War of 1812. So let me get back here. All right, let's see.